The webinar today is applying the Climate Lens Resilience Assessment in a BC context. You can get audio access through your computer, or you can use the phone number that's on the screen and that access code. My name is Kate Murphy, and I also have my colleague Jim Vanderwall with me on the webinar. So this webinar is being presented as a part of the BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative. This collaborative supports local governments, First Nations, and industries in integrating climate change adaptation into their planning and decision making. We also have an online adaptation portal for Adaptation Resources, which you can find on retooling.ca. We have a range of different resources on this portal, but I'm just going to show you a couple of things right now. So this is a snapshot of the website, and you can subscribe to our newsletter in this highlighted area where you can access more information about upcoming webinars, events, and pertinent adaptation tools. And you can also access previous webinars and recordings if you go to this webpage that's highlighted on retooling. A couple of logistics for today. Please keep your audio muted so that there's no background noise during speaker presentations. And if you have any questions, there's a control panel box for questions, so please type it in there. You can also type to ask for a verbal question if you have one. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can either email fraserbasin@gmail.com, or you can ask a question in the question box, and my colleague Jim will help you out with that. So we're very lucky to have two wonderful speakers with us today. The first is François Levesque, who is a policy analyst with Infrastructure Canada, where he has spent the past 2 years. He is the principal author of the Climate Resilience Assessment in the Climate Lens. And prior to this, François worked as a senior researcher for the not-for-profit Institute on Governance based in Ottawa. Our second presenter today is Dirk Nyland, who is the chief engineer at the BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. He has been with the ministry working in this area for over 40 years, and since 2001 he has been the chief engineer. In 2013, he was awarded the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal for his service. Thank you both for being here today. If you have any questions after this webinar, feel free to reach out to Jim or myself. It will be posted as the recording online on that website that I showed you, on the retooling webpage that I highlighted. So I will also send out details about that. And right before we get into François' presentation, I'm just going to host another poll just to see where everybody, what organization you're coming from. All right, good. We've got about 80% who have replied to that, so I'll close that. Looks like we have quite a few private sector here today, quite a few local government, a couple of First Nations attendees, non-governmental organizations or academia are also represented, in quite a few provincial or federal government. Great, well, thank you all so much for joining us. And I'll just pass it over now to François to start us off.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Can you guys hear me okay? I have a bit of feedback here.
I can hear you fine now. There was feedback at the beginning. Oh, there actually still is.
Is this better?
Much better.
Okay. All right, apologies for that. So as Kate mentioned, my name is François Levesque. I'm a policy analyst for the Green Infrastructure and Environmental Initiatives team at Infrastructure Canada. I'm here today to speak about the Climate Change Resilience Assessment, so one half of the Climate Lens. As you probably know, the Climate Lens was publicly launched on June 1st this year in Halifax. And now that we're beginning to receive some projects from different provinces and territories, as part of our new funding, we want to make sure that proponents are well prepared to conduct the climate lens assessment, and we're here to answer any questions that you may have. So today's presentation will focus primarily on the why and the how of the climate lens, but we'll also aim to share some practical aspects with you should you be involved in a climate lens assessment. Before discussing the purpose and operation of the lens, I will start by explaining where the climate lens applies in the broader context of the Investing in Canada plan and 2 national programs for which Infrastructure Canada is responsible. Then I'll touch on the rationale, the intent, and the outcomes of the climate lens. This will be followed by a deeper dive into the mechanics of the resilience assessment and a few practical tips that are related to the lens. And then I'll turn it over to Dirk to speak about BC's experience working in infrastructure and climate change impacts. So before we start, I wanted to start with a question. Have you been involved in an infrastructure project that has taken future climate considerations into account in its design? I'll turn it over to Fraser Basin to open up the poll. If you guys are curious, the picture here is of the new Champlain Bridge in Montreal that's next to the old Champlain Bridge. So it's one of the few projects that Infrastructure Canada is actually responsible for building. Okay, so the answer, 52% yes, 41% no, 7% not sure. All right, thank you. So for those that may not be familiar with our INFC's funding and the broader Investing in Canada plan, I'll go back to budgets 2016 and 2017. These are 2 federal budgets that announced significant investments in infrastructure, over $180 billion over 12 years. The funding broadly supports public transit, green infrastructure, social infrastructure, trade and transportation infrastructure, as well as infrastructure for rural and northern communities. This is called the Investing in Canada Plan and is delivered by 13 federal government departments, including Infrastructure Canada. A subcomponent of that is funded through integrated bilateral agreements, so negotiated between us and each province and territory. That's approximately $33 billion over 12 years. The name of this program is the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program and is delivered through our partners, provinces, and territories. Under ICIP, for short, infrastructure projects are cost-shared between the federal government and its partners, provinces and territories, and municipalities. The streams of funding for each agreement with a province or territory are similar to the ones under the broader plan outlined in the previous slide. One thing that's important to note is under the integrated bilateral agreements, they take an outcomes-based approach as opposed to a pure asset eligibility approach. So this means that a project needs to fulfill at least one of the funding objectives that are set out in a particular stream, and hopefully affords greater flexibility in terms of projects that we would fund compared to past programs. As an example, under the green infrastructure stream, a public infrastructure project would need to support, for example, increased generation of clean energy or increased capacity to adapt to climate change. The climate lens also applies in different ways to 2 national merit-based programs. First of all, there's the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, which is a $2 billion merit-based program that's designed to support national, provincial, and municipal infrastructure that's required to deal with the effects of climate change, as well as the Smart Cities Challenge, which is a pan-Canadian competition open to communities of all sizes, which encourages communities to adopt a smart cities approach to improve the lives of their residents through innovation, data, and connected technology. I'll talk a bit more in detail about how the lens applies to these different programs. First of all, I wanted to talk about some of the domestic drivers that supported the creation of the climate lens? Well, first of all, in 2015, we signed the Paris Agreement, which committed us to reducing our greenhouse impacts and supporting greater adaptation and resilience of Canadian communities. In 2016, there was a private member's motion M45, that was passed in the House of Commons, which stated that before making decisions on infrastructure funding proposals, an analysis of their impact on greenhouse gas emissions should be undertaken for those projects exceeding an appropriate threshold. So this private member's motion was passed and focused on GHGs and was inspiration in support of the one portion of the climate lens, the GHG mitigation assessment. There was also Canada's mid-century long-term greenhouse gas development strategy, as well as the Pan-Canadian framework, which both emphasize lowering greenhouse gas emissions as well as strengthening resilience in infrastructure as key goals of those initiatives. So a second question, in thinking about the climate change resilience assessment, for what areas are you seeking more clarity today? And again, I'll turn it over to Fraser Basin for their poll. So 60% resilience assessment approach, 27% how it's been implemented in BC, 8% how INFC will use the information, 3% on attestation, and 2% others. Thank you. So the work to develop the climate lens also builds on international and national momentum and a growing recognition of the need to consider climate change in infrastructure planning and design. The lens builds on approaches that are pursued by international aid organizations and multilateral development banks, such as the Asian Development Bank. It was also informed by national actions, such as Australia's Coast to DAP initiative, and state-level actions, such as California's Climate Safe Infrastructure 2016 legislation. It was also informed by initiatives such as the 100 Resilient Cities Network, which includes 5 Canadian cities, and other large cities across the world as diverse as New York, Addis Ababa. There's also domestic momentum. The private and not-for-profit sector in Canada and internationally has been involved, notably Engineers Canada and its work to develop the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Protocol, as well as the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure's Envision Rating Scale and criteria, which identify how sustainable approaches can be used to plan, design, construct, and operate infrastructure projects. Finally, I've also included some of the work of the BC engineers and geoscientists who have produced guidelines for incorporating climate resilience in the design of highway infrastructure in BC, and I believe we'll hear a bit more about that via Dirk. So what is the climate lens? Well, the lens will require certain projects to assess expected greenhouse gas emissions that are linked to a project and or the asset's resilience to the impacts of climate change. Both of these assessments support INFC's contribution to the Pan-Canadian framework and support Canada's target for emissions reductions and clean growth economy, as well as building climate resilient infrastructure. The lens was developed in collaboration with Environment and Climate Change Canada, other federal departments, and with input from provinces, territories, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, industry, and other stakeholders. This table is a bit dense, but I would encourage you guys to take a screenshot of it if you can. It's also included in the Climate Lens guidance document. It explains in a bit more detail how the climate lens and particular assessments of the lens apply in which program. All projects in the climate-focused substreams, so green infrastructure, climate change mitigation, or green infrastructure, adaptation, resilience, and disaster mitigation, need to do the relevant assessments. So a GHG mitigation assessment in the context of a GHG mitigating project, and the climate change resilience assessment in the case of an adaptation project. For projects that are above $10 million, they need to conduct both assessments. In terms of the Smart Cities Challenge, winning projects that are targeting a climate-related outcome should complete the relevant assessment when project costs are $10 million or more. Now, there are a number of outcomes that the use of the lens will support, but at a high level, there are three outcomes that are key. So one, we want this to support behavioral change. We want to see a mainstreaming of the integration of climate change mitigation and adaptation consideration in infrastructure decision-making. Two, performance measurement and evidence-based decision-making. So we hope that over time, the results of these assessments will help inform future infrastructure policy and programming. And finally, public awareness, transparency, and accountability. So through the PCF, the Pan-Canadian Framework, Canada's governments have committed themselves to public awareness, and as such, INFC will publicly report on the high-level results of the climate lens assessments to ensure that Canadians have the opportunity to access information on government-led efforts to respond to climate change. So the climate change is a risk assessment that includes the analysis of future climate conditions and appropriate risk treatment. As I've said in many presentations before, at a minimum, we want to ensure that proponents are aware of the climate change risks that are involved in their project or potential risks, and want to facilitate more resilient design, location, retrofit, and operation of an asset. The assessment should broadly follow the ISO 31000 on risk management, which is a broadly adopted standard in both the public and the private sector, and wanted to note that the PIVISI protocol, for example, follows this approach. Now, over time, we do expect that proponents will demonstrate that their assessment follows ISO 31000 as part of the report submitted to INFC. The assessment, because the ISO standard is so broad, is grounded in a set of guiding principles, which I'll come back to in a later slide. And understanding that not all assessments need to be detailed because risks may be greater or smaller depending on the type of asset and other circumstances, our guidance includes some key questions to help proponents determine if a deeper level of analysis is required. Finally, assessments should consider the average lifespan of the asset and look at different climate change scenarios. Now, I'll do a bit of a deeper dive on the guiding principles because I think they're important. These principles are largely derived from international agreements such as the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and Canada's National Strategy for Critical Infrastructure. Both of these emphasize resilience as a way to mitigate disasters and natural hazards. They're also informed by Canada's Federal Adaptation Policy Framework and National Climate Knowledge Assessments, which are produced by Natural Resources Canada. So first guiding principle is around proportionate assessment. So the level of effort and detail in assessing risk and identifying solutions should reflect both the project cost and the scope, and how important the asset is to providing or protecting essential services, so i.e. the criticality of the asset. The approach should also assess climate threats according to the likelihood and severity, asset vulnerability, and also consider infrastructure interdependencies. Number two, systemic analysis of risk. So a network perspective should consider dependencies as well as interdependencies when appropriate. For example, an impact to a single asset could result in significant damage on a citywide or regional or national scale. So understanding the nature and location of other assets that could be affected by a failure is very important. Priority setting should use best available science and data, and you should consider redundancy in your assessment. Pursuit of multiple benefits. So opportunities should be maximized to provide many benefits. For example, considering synergies with greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation initiatives that are not GHG intensive should be strongly considered when possible. Increasing emissions to address climate impacts may be avoided through a detailed assessment of different options to clarify potential GHG impacts of adaptation actions. Finally, avoidance of unintended consequences. So seeking to avoid risk transference from one asset to another, preserving decision-making flexibility over the long term, i.e. avoiding lock-in costly decisions that would narrow future options, and pursuing no regrets approaches. As you know, climate resilience initiatives inescapably face uncertainty given the broad range of projected future climate change impacts, so pursuit of enduring solutions should be prioritized and displacement of costs should be avoided. This slide is something that's also included in the Climate Lens guidance in one of the annexes, and proposes at a high level what information we expect in a climate change resilience assessment. I wanted to note that the project return on investment is something that's a bit challenging to get, particularly in the case of projects that are not adaptation or resilience focused. So the requirement for the return on investment is really specific to adaptation projects, though it may come at a later time for those projects that are not in the adaptation substream. Finally, I wanted to spend a bit of time on attestation. It's an important point that merits some clarification, and we've received a number of questions on this. Now, I want to state that we fully expect that teams conducting the resilience assessment will be multidisciplinary in nature. So it would include professional engineers, architects, planners, and that there would be engagement done with relevant stakeholders that are involved in those assets. However, at the end of the day, this is for infrastructure projects, and the attestation that will be done is to attest that a proponent has followed the appropriate procedure, i.e. has followed the Climate Lens guidance to conduct the climate change resilience. As such, we ask that either a professional engineer or professional registered planner or hydrologist or biologist in the case of natural infrastructure project attest that the assessment, the climate change resilience assessment, has been done according to our guidance. Again, here, the Climate Lens guidance provides a template for the attestation of the resilience assessment. In most cases, the assessments will be uploaded to INFC as part of the project submission, and required information for the climate change resilience assessment that will come to us will include the assessment documents, the signed attestation, as well as required information for our online portal, which would ask specifically for what hazards were considered through the assessment and what resilience measures are proposed to be taken around location, design, planned operation, or maintenance of the asset. For those that don't know, general guidance is available. I've created a short link here because it's a little bit tricky to find on our website. The methodologies and approaches on both the GHG mitigation assessment and the climate change resilience assessment are aligned with international best practices, As I noted earlier, we worked with provinces and territories, FCM, as well as the industry, both planners, engineers, and others, to prepare the guide. It is not a guide that was prepared for novices that want to learn how to do this, and I wanted to stress out, it is written for qualified and experienced professionals. And finally, it's a document that is evergreen in nature, and we, from time to time, will make updates as new resources become available, as we learn from experience from proponents that are conducting the climate lens, both assessments on things that work well, on things that merit more detail, on things that are not working so well. And so we hope to update it on a semi-regular basis. The cost of the climate lens. Well, the costs are retroactively eligible for federal cost sharing, and that is regardless of whether the 10 million threshold is triggered. I wanted to flag that many large engineering firms are able to accommodate both the GHG mitigation assessment as well as the climate change resilience assessment. And when required, applicants may benefit from bundling both assessments into a single procurement. In terms of municipal owned forced labor, so that is to say, if your municipality decides to use its own engineers to conduct the assessment, then the costs associated with that would not be retroactively eligible for cost share. Finally, Indigenous applicants may be eligible for additional support for resilience assessment through Indigenous Services Canada's First Nations ADAPT program or CERNAC's Climate Change Preparedness in the North program. In conclusion, I wanted to say that we understand that this is something new for many proponents across the country, and we do expect an adjustment period. At the same time, we don't see mainstreaming of climate change considerations going away anytime soon. And as capacity grows across the country, we expect that the rigor of assessments will grow as well. Now, I know that BC, as a province, has done a lot of work around resilience at the community level. And from my conversations with colleagues in BC, there seems to be quite a bit of capacity to do this type of work, and we're excited to see what comes out. I wanted to note that the recently announced Comox Valley wastewater treatment plant did conduct a climate lens, conducted both the GHG mitigation assessment as well as the climate change resilience assessment. And that is actually the first project under new ICIP funding that has been announced that has conducted the climate lens. So congrats to you guys. We're also excited to see that a recent provincial survey of engineers suggested that strong professional interest to address climate change is important, but that challenges arising from mandate resources and guidance has been noted. So the lens requirement, along with our new funding, aims to address a number of those challenges. As I've noted, the lens is evergreen and will evolve with ongoing advances in climate modeling and methodologies. And we do hope to hear from those conducting assessments to see what works well and what may require more precision as we update the guidance. I've left a general inbox email. If you have extra questions that you'd like to send us, they are triaged and sent to us, and we try to answer them as soon as possible. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to Dirk Nyland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francois. Right before we go into Dirk, I'm going to launch another poll. And I see that a number of people have been asking questions, so thank you so much for that. We might be a bit tight on time at the end, but we will try and get to some, and otherwise we will provide you our contact emails so you can get in touch with us. So some varied results here. That's great. So people are interested in the finer details. How do I know that I've done enough? The lack of qualified professionals or lack of experience, finding and understanding trustworthy data. And then some people still have some questions about attestation and other issues. So hopefully Dirk will be able to answer some of these questions. I'm sure he will. Just pass it over to him.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this. I trust you can all hear me coming through properly.
I can hear you great.
Okay. So, okay. So in BC, we've been concerned with climate change for quite some time. A lot of our infrastructure over the last 7 or 8 years has been negatively affected by some of the extreme events that we've had. We've seen a substantial increase in heavy precipitation. Obviously, from an engineering and transportation system point of view, you want to think about these sorts of things, deal with them in the design process rather than deal with them through the construction and maintenance process, because your greatest savings are by doing it during the design process.
Dirk, just 1 second. Are you sharing your screen?
I think so.
I'll try and do that again, just because I can't see anything on my end. 1 second.
Okay. It's up on my screen.
I just passed it over again, so if you just hit the accept button. Great, I can see it now. That's perfect.
Okay. I think in interest of time, I won't step back.
For sure.
What we've been doing in BC since I was involved in the development of the PIVISI tool has been using the PIVISI tool over the last 5 or 6 years. The sites we've looked at are the piece of the Coquihalla Highway, a piece of the Yellowhead Highway between Vanderhoof and Burns Lake, and we've looked at some of the results of extreme climate events in Bella Coola, Stewart, and Pine Pass over a few years, just to see how it would all come together. The initial sites were selected because they had different geographic and climatic conditions. What we found that in general our highways are resilient to climate change, with a big exception of extreme precipitation events. Anytime it starts to rain too much, the design criteria that were used in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the last century, just aren't sufficient to handle the type of precipitation and flow we're seeing now. We've developed a list of lessons learned to date over the last 10 years or so. The first one is to make sure that people are aware of climate change and extreme weather events and how they affect infrastructure. We've been working hard to make sure that climate adaptation is included in our organizational practice. Now, from the engineering side, we've been looking at more of how can we make our civil structures more resilient, based on the thought that even if we quit putting CO2 into the atmosphere today, there's still sufficient CO2 out there that the effects will continue for at least another 100 years. So it's vital that we make sure our infrastructure is resilient to that. We've been using multidisciplinary teams, making sure we've had qualified professionals with local knowledge, and we've been making sure that through Engineers Canada and other sources, making sure that there's education for professionals, consultants, and staff and students. Best practices are important. The first thing that we really learned very quickly was that the codes and standards that we've been using are generally okay, but you've really got to look at the data that those codes and standards used. The worst example that we ran into was a copy of the bridge code that was using a 30-year average that was already 30 years old. So obviously that wasn't going to go anywhere. That's certainly been fixed with the new bridge code that's coming up. But those are the sorts of things you want to think about. What are the assumptions in your design processes that you've been using? And have you identified what your climate parameters are and how those climate parameters are going to be affected? Engineering judgment is going to become a little bit more or a lot more important in this stuff, because you're not going to get any sort of black and white answers from climatologists. You're going to get signals and traces. In order to push this along and to make sure that it was actually being done and give this whole process a bit of a push, in 2014 we got together with ECBC, EGBC, and PKIC, and ourselves, and put together a technical circular for making sure climate adaptation design was considered and used in all our work going forward. That came into force in the fall of 2015, and for the last 2 or 3 years now, all our new design, our rehabs, and even our new maintenance contract changes have looked at this stuff. The technical circular, much as the climate lens, requires design for climate change and extreme events from model projections. We want to make sure that you've done a vulnerability screening analysis for the design, taking that into account and looked at the various components. We want to make sure that practical and affordable design criteria and solutions are developed, that for a low volume road, you're not necessarily pulling out all the stops, and maybe for a Trans-Canada or for one of our more heavily trafficked roads, you are paying more attention. In order to track this, as the design has come forward, we've developed, stolen from our geometric design areas, a design criteria sheet, which lists out your climate change parameters in your design, what you would have used, what you are going to use, taking climate change into account, and what process did you use to get to that climate change stuff. This will form a basis for us to make available to folks, to give them some idea how things are moving and how things seem to be changing in various parts of the province. This is what the sheet looks like. All this stuff is on our website, by the way. EGBC took part in the development of the technical circular, and as part of that work, they put together their own group, and they put together a practice guideline for climate change associated with the technical circular, and in other words, our highway infrastructure. But the idea is that this could be used as a guideline for all civil infrastructure. As new projects are developed, what we did for some of the new bridge projects that are being looked at, this is a typical clause that we stick into the RFP to make sure that proponents are aware that climate change is important. There are certain things that we want you to look at. We give you some idea of where you can find this information, and it will be one of the things that we'll use to assess your RFP. This is a quick look at the PIVISI process. It's a 5-step process. It's not anything magic. You set up your scope, you gather your data, you do your risk assessment according to the protocol that's been there. You may wish to do some additional detailed engineering analysis, and then you document the whole thing. There's also an offshoot where you can do a triple bottom line to see how various options might stack up. Sorts of things that you look at to do a vulnerability assessment, really anything and everything that has to do with climate that's in your design. So the components, the age of the infrastructure, any availability of data. So if you built this thing 30 years ago, best you can probably do if you can't find the as-built is find the specifications and the design criteria that were not necessarily the standards that were in use at the time. Begin to look at your geotechnical indicators. Begin to look at your climate. Look at what sort of changes you can be expecting in temperature and precipitation. And don't forget sea level rise for those of you that are on the coast. Specific components within a highway are things like asphalt. Bridges in and of themselves have lots and lots of components you got to look at. ditches, in other words, drainage appliances, catch basins, culverts, and don't forget the third-party utilities that may be sharing your right-of-way. The sorts of extremes that we're seeing and the design parameters that we're concerned about are extreme rainfall, which one or more days of 76 millimeters or more rain in 24 hours. Certainly when we get word that there's a Pineapple Express or an atmospheric river hitting the coast like we've gone through over the last 4 or 5 days, we get concerned and we start watching things more closely. High temperatures are obviously an issue, and temperature variability. I think if you've been following some of the hockey puck curves that are going along, you'll note that the coldest days in the future are going to be warmer than the cold days that we're getting today. Higher temperatures are obviously a problem, and we've been seeing that, and precipitation are a problem. And as the climate lens requires, start looking at the life cycle costs and how long you expect that component to last. So pavements, 15 to 20 years, culverts, 75 years or more, bridges, 50 to 100 years. Those things become important as you start looking out. Within the ministry, we started to make sure for the last 5 or 6 years anyway, that the design, the climate parameters that are used for design are identified. So these are some examples of the types of summary information that we use. So for hydraulic design, we use the Q200, and it's based on historic stream flow gauging and historic weather stations. The climate risks are identified, and then the climatologist information and the climate information through PKIC is applied to see how we can deal with that sort of stuff. Similarly, for thermal movement, it's covered in the Canadian Highway Bridge Design Code, and you identify the parameters, and then you start looking at how those may change. And depending where you are in the province, the change isn't necessarily the same in each area. Slope stability, geotechnical. Our current standard is to make sure we have a safety factor of 1.5. Obviously, as things get wetter and we get more precipitation, those safety factors have to be looked at because it may be more difficult to maintain that 1.5. So again, you have to look at the risks. Pavements, it's covered in our standard spec, but it generally follows the PG grading for bitumens, which is already sensitive to temperature change. Some of the changes that we're expecting, based on what the climatologists are telling us, are at least 30% or more increase in average peak flows than what we've seen in the past. And what's up on the screen right now is sort of what we're thinking may happen 2040 to 2060, 2070, so 30 years hence. Some of the information that we're already getting back from the projects is that in our northern region, which is sort of everything north of Quesnel, we're seeing percent increases up to 30%. In the interior, we're seeing increases maybe 10 to 20%. And on the coast here, we're seeing 11 to 15%. And that seems a little low. That's because we're already experiencing lots of rain, and people are used to designing for high flows on the coast. Culverts, the same sort of scenario, a little lower, but again, it's important. Culverts play a very major role in making sure the reliability and connectivity of our transportation system is maintained. You lose a culvert, you can lose a link very easily. As an example of some replacement work that was done, it's currently being done actually, it's just finished, south of Chetwynd as a result of the flooding that we had in the South Peace in 2016. You'll notice the culvert size. We looked at the return period of 200 years. We looked at the flow rate that was designed for. We looked at what the climate change was predicted to be, and we came up with a new flow rate, and that's what the designs are based on. Similarly, for the work that's being carried on right now here in Victoria on the Trans-Canada at Mackenzie Avenue, same sort of process we went through to determine to make sure that we have resilience. The project that's going on right now on Trans-Canada in North Van went through the same process. We're continuing our work at the moment. We have some funding from NRCan, and we're exploring interdependencies and adaptation economic analysis. One of the questions we get a lot of is how much more is it going to cost us? And through PKIC, we've developed Climate Explorer. There's a number of other resources available through PKIC, the prime one being Plan to Adapt, which gives you a quick thumbnail for what climate change may look like in about 8 or 9 different regions of the province. This is what it looks like. It's not only for transportation, it's for agriculture and HVAC tech work as well. Climate Explorer this is an example. It's in beta test right now, but it will allow us to look at detailed sites a lot more closely than we could in the past, so that you can actually look at a particular bridge site or a particular location and get some better climate predictions for those areas. We have our own adaptation site, which has all the information on it that I've been talking about. It has all the reports that we've been doing. It has all the work that we've been reporting on, covered on. So we're adapting our highway infrastructure for resilience to extreme events like climate change using vulnerability assessments and climate projection tools, which I think is the main thrust with the climate lens as well. That's it.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dirk. So I'll just pass it over to Jim to put his screen on, and we'll go into some questions. So please feel free to write questions in the question box as we go, and we'll get to your question. Francois, I have some questions for you. First one, does the climate lens assessment have to be completed with an application, or can it be completed after funding is approved?
That is a good question, and it's not necessarily a black and white answer, but we expect for adaptation, resilience, disaster mitigation projects that the climate change resilience assessment would come at the time of the application. And for projects over $10 million that are not climate change specific, our expectation is that they would come at the time of application as well. However, there is a process for deferrals, and that's handled on a case-by-case basis, where sometimes deferral is warranted. And for that, I would encourage provinces and territories to speak to their program operations colleagues at INFC.
Great. And a question for Dirk. Ways to control the flows are necessary before the water hits the bridge. What are you including in the designs?
That's a really a good question. It's site specific. In some areas, we just make sure we got good enough clearance. In other areas, we may need to design stilling ponds or debris basins. What we found with the 2016 stuff, that there was so much water coming down, it wasn't so much the water as the debris and the bed load and all the erosion that was carrying, that was plugging things up.
One more question for Francois. What is the expected cost of applying the lens, approximately or at a minimum? And if an application is not successful, can communities still apply for cost sharing?
So the costs of applying the climate lens varies, and it varies not necessarily on the cost size of a project, but on the complexity of a project. And it could be as low as $15,000 for both assessments for non-complex projects, but it could be much higher as well, depending on the complexity and the complexity of the project. And complexity usually equals larger costs. But so in the case of larger projects, it could be more close to $100,000.
Thank you. Another question for Dirk. François, I hear a little bit of feedback. Dirk, could you tell us more about the economic analysis project with NRCan? Specifically, will a tool or methodology be available for others or publicly?
Yeah, at minimum, we'll have a set of guidelines. What we're finding, and I think it's covered in the climate lens as well, is that there's interdependencies. And certainly as a transportation organization, if we start looking at hardening our drainage infrastructure, what does that mean for those that are downstream from us? What does it mean for those that are upstream from us? What are some of the issues related to making our infrastructure more resilient, particularly during the construction phase? If it's going to take a little bit longer, what does that mean? Because we're dealing with the provincial transportation system and the highway, shutting the highway down for any length of time is really problematic. I think those of you that live in BC will have experienced that with all our avalanche closures that we have every winter, and some of the other closures that we have because of forest fires and flooding issues. So we're looking at that, and we're looking at how we can better deal with that. Maybe we need to spend a lot more time talking to municipalities, talking to transportation companies, talking to railroads about how it's all coming together. And out of that out of the process will come a set of guidelines and recommendations as to how we're going to deal with that.
Thank you. François, there is a bit of feedback from someone's line. Great, it's gone. Question for François, read the application of the resilience assessment. Under the DMAF application, how can one best capture a multi-hazard solution when the application only allows the selection of one main hazard?
I'm not a specialist for DMAF, but I believe there's a section for co-benefits, and it could be listed under that particular section.
Great.
Are you hearing feedback from me?
I'm not hearing feedback anymore. Oh,
okay,
a tiny bit. That's fine. It's quite low. Dirk, another question. Any consideration by MOTI to look at using longer life, rigid concrete pavements instead of asphalt from a life cycle perspective?
It's been looked at, and so far we haven't gone that way for the system as a whole. We've gone that way, obviously, for bridges and for select places on the highway system where we need the additional strength. But no, we haven't looked at a general application for asphalt or for concrete for quite some time.
Great. All right, so a couple of rather connected questions, François. First, can architects be involved in a resilience assessment?
Yeah, I would expect that they would be involved. One of the other professions I didn't know when I was talking was climatologists or folks that offer climate services, and I would expect that they would be involved also in the resilience assessment, or that their services would be utilized to not only get that climate data, but transfer it into something useful and actionable for engineers and architects and planners.
Mm-hmm. Great. So this is very, very similar. For attestation, are other professional designations acceptable, such as professional agrologist, if that person has experience with climate change vulnerability assessments?
I would say at the time At this time, no. We're keeping it to the 4 that we've listed thus far. But I guess this is something that we will keep an eye on and review over time to see if it makes sense to expand that list.
Great. So one more question for Dirk regarding precipitation. What are the tools being used to develop the percent flow increases to be applied? From PKIC, ? Will these percent increased values replace what is provided by Environment Canada in the IDF charts? And will BC supplement to TAC be updated to reference the requirements to include PKIC values?
That's a whole lot of questions. IDF curves are one of the tools that's being used by our hydrologists. The issue in BC is that we don't have a lot of up-to-date IDF tools for the various places in the province, so that's being worked on. We are working with climatologists at PKIC. They are providing us with the changes, the anticipated changes as their models show them for the various parts of the province, which is what Climate Explorer will do for us, give us a little bit better focused information at specific sites rather than looking at, say, a 300 by 300 kilometers square. So yes, that work is underway. That work is based on PKIC information. To the extent that Environment Canada starts to get into that, and it's more through the Canadian Climate Center that's just been established by Environment Canada that will be getting that information. They're beginning to operate a process and an agency similar to what PKIC does, so that's something that should be looked at as well.
One more for you, Dirk. How did you bring on board senior leadership and decision makers, and how is MOTI rolling out the technical circular to staff?
Last question first. The technical circular is part of our normal process whenever we want to update our requirements. So that was rolled out to staff and consultants, like I said, in the fall of 2015, and that's through our website. All the technical circulars are public facing. They're on our website. What the first part was? First part of the question again?
The first part was, how did you bring on board senior leadership and decision makers?
I guess the short answer, that scared the shit out of them, but no. Once we started looking at this back in 2008, 2009, I went to the executive and said, here's what's coming our way, here's what we need to do. The Office of Chief Engineer is responsible for ensuring that our technical standards and guidelines are kept up to date. So it was a matter of working with them and keeping them in the loop as to what's going on. Certainly, the fact that we had the Auditor General's report earlier this year helped to focus the importance of taking it into account. But certainly within MOTI, I've never had any issue with pushing this issue forward and making it advance.
So we have time for maybe one or two more questions. One for you, Francois. Is there support for smaller communities for whom the cost of the climate lens assessment might make grant application cost prohibitive?
So I'm not sure I understood well the question. For smaller communities, just like larger communities, the cost of the climate lens is retroactively reimbursable according to the cost share, same cost share as the project. Now, if projects are not ultimately successful and are not funded, I know there have been discussions with provinces and territories, and I don't think I know BC's point of view on this, but of using administrative funding that the province received through the integrated bilateral agreement to support payment of an unsuccessful climate lens. That would be something to check in with the province. but I know there had been discussions in some provinces around doing that.
Wonderful. Well, it is 11, so I'd like to thank everyone who attended the webinar today for your attendance and also your questions. François and Dirk, thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge with us. If your question was not answered, feel free to get in touch with us and we will forward those on to François and Dirk. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Thank you.